My name is Tricia Pritikin, and I was born and raised next to a place called Hanford, which was a Manhattan Project and Cold War nuclear weapons production site located in eastern Washington state within the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I'm here today because for the 75th commemoration of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while we pause to honor the many, many Japanese individuals and others who were in Japan at the time, who died or who suffered from radiation sickness after the bombings, we must also stop to consider the many, many civilians within the United States who live downwind of nuclear weapons production sites like Hanford. Many people have not heard of Hanford, other than perhaps a few news stories about our leaky tanks. We have 77 leaking tanks full of high-level radioactive waste at Hanford. We have collapsing tunnels within which trains filled with radioactive animals that were experimented upon and other waste. The tunnels have collapsed. So that's what people have mostly heard about. But people like me, born and raised near Hanford, now suffer from a range of radiogenic disease and cancers, which are identical to what is seen in people downwind of the Nevada test site, where atomic tests, above ground tests were conducted during the Cold War beginning in 1951. And also seen in people in the Marshall Islands, where the United States tested, that's in the Pacific Ocean, tested huge hydrogen bombs and other bombs in the 50s. Now, the reason it's important to stop and consider what happened to civilians, particularly children who are very vulnerable to radiation, during both the Manhattan Project and the Cold War. And I must say also those downwind of the Trinity test site, where the very first atomic bomb was tested in 1945. Civilians are now suffering, if they haven't already died, from a range of cancers and other diseases. The reason it's important, as I was going to say, to consider this is that the Trump administration has been making noise about the possibility of resuming testing. We can't let that happen. For anytime there's nuclear testing, there are people downwind of those tests who would be exposed to radioactive fallout. There are production sites that produce the bombs that are tested. People downwind of those sites will also be exposed to radioactive fallout from the production. Now, Hanford produced plutonium, and it was actually the primary site of plutonium production for the Manhattan Project, and then for the Cold War nuclear arms buildup. It was a really messy process in which there were a total of 9 production reactors along the Columbia River, in which fuel rods were irradiated, then shoved out the backs of the reactors, transported by trains to chemical separations, and then through a very messy process, which released a lot of radiation into the air and into the Columbia River, a tiny, tiny amount of plutonium was extracted. The plutonium that was produced at Hanford was used for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, and also in the Trinity test that I just mentioned. Now, when, as Hanford continued production, it kept reassuring people living around the facility that it was a safe place to live and that Hanford posed no harm. But then in the early 1980s, people started reporting cancers and other diseases in the farms across from the reactors on the Columbia River. And an investigative reporter from Spokane Spokesman Review named Karen Dorn Steele began to report on those cancers and other illnesses. As concern grew over the safety of Hanford, pressure began to be put on the Department of Energy, and a group was formed in Spokane called HEAL, the Hanford Education Action League. And that group brought in speakers to talk about the dangers of radionuclides a reverend named William Huff, who was the reverend of the Unitarian Church in Spokane, wrote a sermon called The Silent Holocaust, which educated people on the dangers of radionuclides. And finally, in response to both FOIAs, that's Freedom of Information Act requests, and public pressure, the Department of Energy in 1986, which is 40 years after Hanford began to secretly release radiation to the air and water, they finally declassified early Hanford operating documents that revealed that Hanford had released throughout the Pacific Northwest, through eastern Washington, Idaho, western Montana, into northern Oregon, and into the Columbia River directly, which impacted communities both in Oregon and Washington that were downriver, had released thousands and hundreds of thousands of curies of a range of radionuclides. Just for comparison's sake, 3 Mile Island released 19 to 21 curies of I-131 in 1979 when they had a partial meltdown. Hanford released over 750,000 curies of radioiodine. I'm not saying that 3 Mile Island was not a serious event. I think there were a lot of people who were injured from their exposures downwind of 3 Mile Island. But in order to put it in perspective, Hanford released chronic amounts, chronically, of airborne radiation and waterborne radiation over 40 years and did not disclose this to us until 1986. At that time, over 5,000 people filed lawsuits, personal injury lawsuits against the former contractors that ran Hanford. And the action was filed as a public utility action under the Price-Anderson Act. We have a new book out. I say we because it's a collaborative effort. It's called The Hanford Plaintiffs, and it has a foreword by Karen Dorn-Steele, and it has the story of 24 former Hanford plaintiffs. The reason I wrote this book was to document our stories before they vanish from the public conscience. I feel that now that after 24 years, the litigation finally settled, only 3 people out of 5,000 had had a chance to tell their stories before a jury of their peers. And because of the length of the litigation, the public interest in the Hanford story waned, and people began to think about other things, and our stories just weren't in the news any longer. And now that the cases have settled for very meager settlements, I'm talking several $1,000s for a cancer or cancer death, very, very meager settlements. I was afraid that the stories would go away if we didn't collect them and publish them. And with the help of 2 law firms for plaintiffs' counsel, that's Tom Folds in Seattle and Richard Iman in Spokane, I was able to contact or send out a letter to former plaintiffs asking who would like to participate, and I ended up with 24 people. These stories, many of these people have not shared their stories before. And if you read these stories, it provides very solid evidence for why no further testing of nuclear weapons should be done, and why nuclear weapons cannot be a part of our world in the future. The suffering that occurs following exposures is horrendous. I can say this from personal experience. I myself lost my father to thyroid cancer, which was caused by his on-the-job exposure. He was a nuclear engineer at Hanford. My mother died of very aggressive malignant melanoma. When the Hurdle cells were found in my thyroid, which are indicative of a form of thyroid cancer, my entire thyroid was removed, and I now have hypoparathyroidism, which means I lost 3 of 4 parathyroids, and it's a very perilous disease in which your calcium plunges, and you get tetany and seizures, and your kidney function is impaired to the point of kidney failure. So it's very complicated. And many of the people I grew up with now have a range of endocrine cancers, and they have thyroid cancers, autoimmune diseases, infertility, miscarriages, and these are the same diseases you see with the Nevada test site downwinders, the Trinity test site downwinders, Marshall Islanders, all the same diseases. And our government has never been held accountable for these injuries. And we had a medical monitoring program that was approved by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry due to our high exposures, and the Department of Energy refused to fund that. So we've received no help. We've received very little in the way of compensation through the settlements, but many of the 5,000 plaintiffs received nothing. And sort of the last thing I'd like to do after, before I finish here, is to read just a real quick excerpt from this book, from the Hanford plaintiffs, because I think it exemplifies the spirit of this project and all of us, what we wanted to accomplish with this project. And by the way, the proceeds from this book go to, the net proceeds of this book go to the work of CORE, which is the Consequences of Radiation Exposure, which is found at corehanford.org. We are an organization, a nonprofit dedicated to increasing public awareness of the civilians in the United States and the Marshall Islands who have been injured as a result of nuclear weapons production and testing. This is from chapter 1, The Forgotten Guinea Pigs. An expectant mother drinks multiple glasses of milk every day throughout her pregnancy, faithfully following the latest government-issued nutritional guidelines for a healthy baby. Unbeknownst to her, the milk she drinks is saturated with a radioactive isotope of iodine known as I-131. The radioactive iodine easily crosses the placental barrier, gravely damaging the thyroid gland of her fetus. The year is 1950. The fetus is me. Throughout the U.S. Pacific Northwest, beginning in late December 1944, and for several decades thereafter, thousands of Americans like my mother and me were chronically exposed to destructive levels of ionizing radiation. We have reaped the devastating health consequences throughout our often abbreviated lives. In this book, I endeavor to give voice to a group of Americans whose stories are largely unknown. These are the stories of innocent civilians poisoned by widespread radioactive fallout, the byproduct of plutonium production at the Hanford Nuclear Weapons Complex, a federal facility that operated on the Columbia River in southeastern Washington state without public scrutiny, exempt from most federal, state, and local regulations for more than 40 years. It's interesting how in the middle of the COVID pandemic, we again see the federal government unable to care for the welfare of its own citizens. It feels like a repeat to people like me. Okay, Sean, I'm done.